To our top story now, and the Bank of England is poised to raise interest rates for the 14th consecutive time today as it fights to take back control of inflation.
Well, signs do suggest that inflation is coming down, with policymakers set to opt for a quarter rather than a half-point rise. If we know all that at this stage, why do we have to wait till 12 o'clock for the announcement? It's like we sort of know what's going to happen.
It's very true, isn't it?
Yeah.
You could say that with a lot of things in this business, I think, when we get a copy of the speech hours before it actually is said. Anyway, joining us for more is the Reform UK advisor, Ben Habib. Really good to see you this morning, Ben. So we are expecting that 14th rise in a row from the Bank of England at midday, but inflation is coming down.
It
so
is.
Is it really needed?
It's coming down very slowly, but your question is spot on. You know, we've had 13 interest rate rises. And one of the things about the way the British economy acts at the moment is that it's much slower to react to interest rate rises than it used to be when I was a young man. In those days, most people borrowed money on floating rate interest. So you immediately felt the impact of an interest rate rise in your back pocket, you know, with your mortgage bills going up. But nowadays, most people are on fixed rate mortgages. So it takes a while for the transmission of interest rate increases to impact the economy and to curb demand. And there's a real risk here that the Bank of England is going to overdo it. And I think the government's already preparing us for it, because they're talking about the country needing potentially to go into recession in order to get inflation back under control. You talked about tone deafness. Can you imagine what that's like for the electorate to hear when you've got a cost of living crisis, your mortgage bills are going through the roof, 5.9 million people on universal credit, and the government saying, well, actually, you know, a bit of necessary medicine's going to be a recession. Great. Terrific.
It's not what we need, is it? Look, with all of this, there's always been the argument with this that this doesn't work anyway, because the inflation that we're experiencing at the moment is because of things that we have no choice but to buy.
You're absolutely right. The inflation we're experiencing is not because we've had a demand-led boom in the economy with everyone going mad buying new sofas and housing. The inflation we've got is a direct result of lockdowns, the breaking of supply chains, the breaking of labour markets, the pushing up of energy prices. And that's all raising interest rates will have zero impact on all those costs, including, most pertinently, food, which we all, surprise, surprise, need to consume in order to survive.
So, I mean, is this a case of the Bank of England just doing something to look like it's doing something, rather than having any tangible effect, apart from causing more misery?
Well, it's a really good question. There are people who argue that all the printing of money that took place during the pandemic has caused this inflationary boom. Personally, I don't think that's the case. It's not a matter of excess cash in the economy. I think you're absolutely right. It's the breaking of the supply chains, breaking of labour markets, etc., that's caused this inflationary bout. I think the Bank of England could possibly have done much less and be in the same position. The economy would be in the same position that it's in now. The Bank of England, of course, is laying on even more pain about which we're not aware. It owns about 40% of all government debt. Government debt now is about 100% of GDP, just over £2 trillion, and about £900 billion of that is owned by the Bank of England. And in order to balance its own books, it's selling some of that debt into the market, which is raising the cost of funding for the government, raising the cost of funding for us in the economy as well. So it's almost doing two things to slow us down: taking cash out of the economy by selling government bonds, as well as raising interest rates. And I think they will overdo it. In my life, I've never known a central bank to get it spot on. They always overdo stimulus when they need to stimulate the economy, and they always overdo constraining the economy when they need to constrain it.
The IEA has said the bank should hold off. It should wait for these previous interest rates to take effect before raising them any further. It says it's going to inflict more economic damage doing things this way. Is that something you'd agree with?
I completely agree with that. And the other thing that, is allied to that is that the government is completely out of ideas of how to grow the economy. You know, we could all deal with inflation more easily if our businesses were growing, if our wages were growing, and we were flourishing, but we're not. And we're caught in a kind of doom loop where the cost of living is very high, government debt is very high, taxes are very high, and it's not paying to work. We've got this broken labour market that I mentioned. Companies are not investing because they're being taxed very highly. Rishi Sunak made all that fanfare last week of issuing 100 new licences for drilling gas in the North Sea. But very few of those gas licences are going to be used because oil and gas companies are taxed at 75% of their profits. There's no incentive for them to go in and make the investment required to extract that oil and gas. And, of course, the other thing that we haven't touched on, which I will touch on now just since we're on the North Sea, is the embedded cost of our energy. You know, we've had completely hopeless or absence of any energy policies, a coherent energy policy for the last 25 years. And so we've ended up turning our back on North Sea oil, which would have provided plentiful supply of domestic fossil fuels, turning our back on that, championing this drive to net zero and renewables, way ahead of the technology being ready for it. And, of course, all of that is very costly for the economy, embeds in inflation, dampens growth, and continues that doom loop.
In terms of growth, then, because that is so essential to get us going, how do we stimulate growth? Because nobody seems to have... I mean, look, at least the Labour Party had some sort of policy with the green growth agenda, whatever they were calling it, though they've scaled back on that.
The 28 billion they want.
The 28 billion, yeah, they say we can't afford that now. Within the current system with this government, I mean, one thing which is being really badly hit is the housing market, which is a key stimulus for growth. So that's been really hit and all of that. So how do we start to push growth in this country?
Well, I mean, there are a number of things that I would do straight away. The first is to take lower wage earners out of the tax net completely. I'd raise the threshold on paying tax to $20,000 a year rather than the 12.5, which is where it's at. It's got to pay to work. We've got to get those 5.9 million people who are partially surviving on universal credit, some of them entirely, I think about 2.5 million entirely surviving on universal credit, back into the workplace. If they get back into the workplace, you automatically have a growing economy. We've got to cut taxes on business, and we've got to deregulate. There's been a big amount spoken about ESG, environmental, social, corporate governance regulations, you know, the reason Nigel Farage was debanked. But the other side of the ESG coin is that it's a huge burden on businesses. People often say to me, you're a Brexiteer, which regulations do you want to so desperately ditch? Well, I'll give you one, ESG. Ditch it. It's a huge burden on business. We need to take the regulatory knee, as it were, off the neck of the private sector. We need to cut taxes on the private sector. We need to cut taxes on the working and middle classes. And we've got to get the organism, the economic organism, moving forward again. And at the moment, we're in this doom loop where the government's looking at its deficit, thinking, oh, my goodness, we can't cut taxes because we can't afford to do it. We can't borrow more because we can't afford to do it. We can't spend much more. And they just don't know where to go. They've got to have the courage of knowing that cutting taxes, deregulating, will stimulate the economy, and when the economy grows, actually their tax take will automatically grow.
Just briefly then, hate to say it, I sort of really do hate to say it, yeah. That sounds like Trussonomics.
It is Trussonomics. And one more thing I want to talk about on Truss. She was absolutely right. She understood what was required. And at the same time that she was unveiling her mini-budget, or indeed the day before, the Bank of England was briefing against her, talking about a recession. The Bank of England was selling gilts. Do you remember I mentioned the Bank of England was reversing some of the purchases it had made of government bonds? And as it was selling those gilts, it created the pension fund crisis that was all blamed on Liz Truss. The Bank of England didn't like Liz Truss's agenda, and it decided it was going to defenestrate her. And this might sound almost on the verge of conspiracy theory. It isn't. If you look back and you see what the Bank of England did, in the days running up to Liz Truss's mini-budget and immediately thereafter. They almost conspired to make her plan fail.
Ben Habib, good to talk to you this morning. Thanks very much indeed.
You.